Welcome to the Birding for Joy podcast, a show about discovering and exploring all the ways birding and wild birds bring joy into our lives. Throughout Season 4, we'll be focusing our attention on simple actions we can take in our daily lives to help birds and nature. I'm Candi Lynn Fite, your gracious host and joyful birder. If you're curious about learning how you too can live a bird-friendly lifestyle, grab your favorite beverage, settle on your perch, and let's get into today's episode. Greetings, dear listeners. If you've listened to the show before, welcome back. If this is your first time tuning in, I am so happy you're here. I hope this episode finds you all happy and healthy and finding precious moments to venture outdoors and spend time with the birds. Speaking of venturing outdoors and spending time with the birds, did you participate in the Great Backyard Bird Count this past weekend? I'm happy to share that I did 3 different counting sessions: a 45-minute woodsy walk near my home, 30 minutes in the front and backyards, and a short 15-minute roadside session a few miles from the house. I counted 23 species during the walk in the woods and 21 species while strolling in my yards. I added the short roadside counting session because I often see overwintering American kestrels perched on the power lines overlooking the fields. Even though they frequent my local area, they don't usually venture into my yard. But I wanted to offer that species snapshot to the overall bird count. I had the pleasure of observing 3 American kestrels during that count. Between all 3 sessions, I observed and reported 31 species for the bird count. I have to say the sparrows were the most exciting. With the help of the Merlin Bird ID app, I managed to identify 8 species of sparrows, which would have been difficult since the majority observed were ground feeding in my yard. They were the grasshopper sparrow, chipping, lark, white-crowned, white-throated, Savannah, song, and Lincoln sparrow. Counting them was a challenge, but I did the best I could by following instructions for counting flocks in the Bird Counting 201 article on the ebird.org website. In the end, it felt good to contribute to the Community Bird Science Project, and I had fun while participating. For the next several episodes, we'll be focusing on another of the 7 simple actions to live bird-friendly as presented by the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute. The simple action is plant native plants to shelter and nourish birds. When I decided to incorporate the 7 simple actions to live bird-friendly into Season 4, I realized that although the actions we can take are simple and easy to implement into our lives, I wanted to explore these topics in depth here on the podcast so that we can not only learn together, but we can also gain a better understanding of why and how these simple actions help birds. I could just tell you that planting natives helps shelter and nourish birds, but I would be underserving you and the bird-friendly cause. Instead, I want to work alongside of you on this exploration to live more bird-friendly lifestyles, because together we can make a difference. I'm sure some of you listeners have heard that since 1970 we've lost 3 billion birds. Scientists and researchers say these numbers indicate an urgent biodiversity crisis, and it requires action. The results of the latest State of the Birds report are staggering. They are a wake-up call. Although the study focused on bird populations and not about the causes of the decline, scientists have identified the largest contributor to the decline in bird populations as habitat loss. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, millions of acres of bird habitat are lost or degraded every year to development, agriculture, and forestry practices. And simply stated, when habitats are lost or degraded, they can no longer support the wildlife populations. Yes, millions of birds are directly killed each year by human-caused sources such as collisions with man-made structures like windows and communication towers, predation by feral cats, poisons, among with other various threats. but we will cover those other threats in future episodes. For now, we'll focus on habitat loss and how we can mitigate this threat by planting natives and creating habitats in our yards to support birds, especially migratory birds. Last summer, I released 2 episodes about how habitat loss affects wild birds and how planting natives in your yard benefits them. Instead of telling you just to go back and listen, I figured it would be more helpful to reutilize some of the information. In today's episode, I'm going to insert a portion of one of those episodes that aligns with the topic. Let's listen to some of Season 3's Episode 3, titled, "We Can Do Hard Things for the Birds." After chatting with Pamela Lowell and reading her book, My Summer with Ospreys, and now listening to Trish O'Kane's Birding to Change the World, it has become increasingly apparent to me that this topic is important. It needs to be talked about, and there needs to be change. In many ways, I already understood the importance of conservation, and I already do some things to help. But I can do more, and I can encourage others to do more. Maybe someone or two will listen. With this podcast, I have a voice, and it is time that I spoke up. Becoming a birder has changed me. It has opened my eyes and my mind. The birds have taught me to become acutely aware of the environment, habitat, the importance of biodiversity and conservation. And unlike anything or anyone out there discussing the ramifications of the climate change, the wild birds are showing me that the threat is real. It is happening and will continue to happen until we humans change our ways. Whether you believe in climate change or think it's just a bunch of malarkey, it's difficult to deny or argue that the climate is shifting, changing, and not in a positive way. One only has to look to nature to see the negative impacts the unstable environment is having on our planet. The proof is not in the pudding, but in nature. The flora and fauna, the waters, the ground upon which we walk, and the air which we breathe. I am not a doomsdayer. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not easily swayed by the opinions of others, but I am an observer. I'm a reader, a researcher, and in a perpetual state of learning. I pay close attention to details. I'm extremely sensitive. I am keenly aware of my surroundings. I consider myself instinctive and intuitive, and everything in my gut is telling me things must change. Because humans are major contributors to the problem, and we have the capabilities of rectifying the situation, it is up to us to create change. It is up to us to make this right. Overall, Mother Nature is showing us that she's in trouble. But for the sake of this podcast, let's focus on the wild birds and what they're showing us. Birds make an excellent indicator species to reflect the health of the environment for several reasons. Primarily because birds are found in almost every ecosystem on Earth, but also because they are easy to observe and count. Scientists have already done extensive research on them, and we understand how they relate to their environments. Combine these with the fact that the birds help signal pollution, habitat loss and recovery, and the outbreak of diseases, it is safe to say birds are important in environmental science and human health. According to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, the State of Birds report last done in 2022 reports that many North American bird species in every type of habitat except the wetlands have decreased in numbers due to habitat loss, environmental degradation, among other global threats. The report also identifies 70 tipping point species that have lost half or more of their breeding population since 1970, and these species are on track to lose another half or more in the next 50 years. I read on the American Bird Conservancy website that we have lost more than a quarter of our bird life since 1970. And this is based on scientific evidence from not just one source, but collective research from 7 different institutions. The evidence proves our wild birds are in trouble. A side note before we move on. If you are also concerned about other wildlife, the bunnies, bees, butterflies, chipmunks, turtles, etc., I'm with you. Habitat loss affects all creatures. So, if we set out to improve the biodiversity in our areas, all wildlife will benefit. The concern for habitat loss and how it affects wildlife began last summer when I took my last evening forest walk on my in-laws' property to see Chauncey, the fledgling barred owl. That weekend, the bulldozer and tractor were busy back there cutting and clearing. Of course, it's not my land, so I couldn't say anything. But when I went out Monday evening, after all the commotion was over, Chauncey did not fly out to greet me at the forest edge as he had done for nearly 3 months. After a week, I stopped looking for him. Since then, I have done a lot of birding. I have seen a lot more destructive habitat loss. I have done a lot of research on conservation, ecology, and how to create change to help make a difference. I have also suffered from paralyzing eco-anxiety, where I'm just walking around with my head down, my heart stuck in my throat, and trying like hell not to sink to the ground and give up. But I know I am not alone. I may not be able to convince my neighbors to quit clearing the forest, but there are others out there who feel the same way I do. They know the benefits of biodiverse ecosystems. They understand the consequences of habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. So if you are feeling overwhelmed or concerned by environmental issues, I get you. I see you. And there is hope, because together we can make a difference. As Wendell Berry so eloquently says, to cherish what remains of the earth and to foster its renewal is our only legitimate hope for survival. It's been a while since I recorded that episode. Listening brings back the raw emotions over Chauncey the barred owl and the feeling of hopelessness I was experiencing at the time. After I decided to take action, the hopelessness dissipated and the heaviness lifted. Since then, my husband and I have been working on creating a wildlife habitat here on our tiny 2 acres. We have planted 19 additional trees and shrubs that are native to our local region. Sure, it'll take time for those trees and shrubs to grow. So in the meantime, I'll continue to fill those bird feeders. This spring, when you're considering what plants or trees to add to your landscape, keep in mind that native plants to your region are the foundation of all terrestrial food webs and the foundation of a healthy, biodiverse landscape. The birds and wildlife rely on native plants and trees for shelter, nesting, and nourishment. The relationship between birds and native trees and plants, and the insects that depend on them, has co-evolved since their existence. When a disruption occurs, such as clearing land for agriculture or economic development, the entire ecosystem is thrown off kilter. Without a native landscape, the wildlife simply cannot survive. Think about when a new housing community is developed. Most, if not all, the native trees are cleared. Native grasses, plants, and shrubs are removed. The natural topography of the land and any waterways are altered. Structures are built, concrete is poured, non-native trees, plants, shrubs, grasses, and soils are introduced. Most wildlife will have already either perished or vacated. Some will stay and learn to adapt. Now, it'll be up to the new homeowners to reestablish balance by creating habitats and rebuilding healthy ecosystems. This is where doing research about what trees, shrubs, plants, and grasses are native to specific regions. From there, one can select bird-friendly choices. Thankfully, the internet offers us a wealth of information and resources. As an example, on the Audubon.org website, there's a region-specific native plant database. All you have to do is plug in your zip code and search by plant type, food source, or bird species that you want to attract. And that's just one online database. There are several more. I'll add a link to the Audubon Native Plant Database in the show notes. Let's circle back to the simple action we're focusing on. Plant native plants to shelter and nourish birds. You might ask, well, can't a bird seek shelter or nest in any tree? In the case of seeking shelter, the answer would probably be yes. When the need arises, most birds will take shelter or stop to rest in most any tree, as they would a fence post. But when it comes to nesting, birds will search out the native trees or shrubs. It's instinct. They naturally choose a tree or shrub species that offers them the proper location to nest and provide them food for themselves and their young. If you've read the remarkable book by entomologist Doug Tallamy, Nature's Best Hope, you might be familiar with this little nugget of information. 96% of all terrestrial birds in North America feed their nestlings insects. I recently relayed this to a few of my friends who were astonished, and they admitted that they never really thought about it. But if a nesting bird can't find the right type of insects or caterpillars, they can't feed their young. Tallamy's research about how native plants support native insects, which support wildlife, is extensive and eye-opening. For instance, his findings show that oak trees, considered a keystone species in the landscape, support 934 different species of caterpillars nationwide, making oaks by far the best plant to include if you want to support food webs. Caterpillars are the preferred food of many bird species and their nestlings. And since the typical nestling eats at least 30 to 40 times a day, that's a lot of caterpillars per chick. Let's look at the Carolina chickadee as an example. Before fledging the nest, a clutch of Carolina chickadee young can consume between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars over the nesting period, which is about 16 days on average. But the job of feeding the young isn't over for the busy parents after the chicks have left the nest. After fledging, the parents continue to feed their young for an additional 21 days. Now think about all the other species of birds in your yard. If each pair of breeding birds needs thousands of caterpillars to feed their clutch of nestlings, can you imagine the total number needed to produce enough food to support all the birds that live in your yard? The bottom line is, if we don't have caterpillars and insects, we don't have birds. There is an argument that non-native trees and plants support insects, but most likely they're not the insects that birds want or need to feed their young. Remember, native plants support native insects that support native wildlife. We'll talk more about Doug Tallamy, his research, and his incredible project called Homegrown National Park, a conservation movement focusing on planting natives to rebuild the biodiverse ecosystems that support all life, in a later episode. On Friday, I will be traveling to Northern Illinois to help my best friend during her knee replacement surgery. The surgery will be at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and there's a really good chance we'll be able to leave a day early so that we have the opportunity to explore Sac-Zim Bog, a nature preserve and birder's paradise not too far from Duluth. My friend is also a fellow birder and a phenomenal photographer. It should prove to be quite the birdie-ful adventure. My decision to travel and help her was sort of last minute, so next week's episode will be a hybrid episode with some new content I've already recorded, along with a replay of part of an episode from last season about gardening for birds. The content aligns well with the simple action of planting natives to shelter and nourish birds, which I hope you find useful and thought-provoking. Until next time, I wish you well and joyful birding, my friends. If you are enjoying the Birding for Joy podcast, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe to the show. Subscribing and tuning in to the episodes allows the algorithms on the platforms to know that the podcast is providing you worthwhile content and helps ensure the success of the show. Remember, the absolute best way to support your favorite podcast is by word of mouth. So make sure to share Birding for Joy with others who might enjoy listening. That way we can continue to build a joyful birding community. As always, thank you for tuning in, my friends.